have today is a bit of a presentation that tells you what the culmination was of our thinking on this and how we fit in with the region. Now, the reason for doing this, and it's been quite interesting in going down this path for the past almost a year now, and it's been the change in the perception of faculty. One of the first conclusions that everyone drew in thinking through what do we do was that what the university does best is what we've always done, basically, and that's research. We're a research organization and we're a teaching organization, and we do community service, and that's our three roles as the University of California, and that's what we should do. And so we began thinking about how can we organize our research efforts and what should we do. And it's been a change in the way faculty perceive things, because largely, not exclusively, faculty are engaged in their own particular research, and not necessarily is it always engaged with the community at large. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. But it was clear that everyone was very actively interested in doing this. And if we look at this next transparency, what we've found in the course of the year that there's a number of areas, and that's who the speakers are going to be, where Homeland Defense shakes down into. And this is what you're going to hear about, is how the University of California is engaged, at San Diego, is engaged in research. And it basically breaks down into bioterrorism and anti-terrorism, cybersecurity, critical infrastructure, disaster communications and response, and public policy. These are basic areas that in one way, shape, or form cover the spectrum of things that the university might be associated with in response to Homeland Security. Now, one of the conclusions in thinking about this, and just to take you back in time, in one of our meetings where we had it with the faculty and the deans and the vice chancellors, we met in a group. It was a large group. It was larger than this group, and everyone expressed an interest in participating. But now you have this panoply of people engaged in a number of disciplines, and then the issue becomes, what are you going to do? How are you going to integrate this into some sort of organization, into some sort of a plan where one can walk out of the door and do something that's of benefit beyond what you do as a single individual? And we came to a conclusion that's a similar conclusion to a large number of people, certainly within the region, in a number of organizations. And in the next PowerPoint presentation is a pictorial of the conclusion we came to, and a lot of people in this region have come to the same conclusion. And quite simply, it's this. One can argue that if you choose any city in the United States or in the world, it's unique. Every city is unique. It's like snowflakes. Everyone is different. San Diego has its own footprint. What makes us different here in San Diego, and why we came to the conclusion at UC San Diego that we want to participate in this as a region, is the following. San Diego has a lot of things pulled together that makes us a microcosm. We have a very strong military presence. The Navy, the Marines, south and north of us. Very large footprint, one of the largest in the countries. We have an enormous high-tech footprint here. We have biotech, we have communications, we have electronic industries par excellence in the region. We have universities, we have community colleges, we have a very strong educational community. We have tourism. We're on a port, we're on the ocean, we're on a border. We have one of the busiest international borders in the world right here in our own backyard. We have a nuclear reactor. We have a large public response and first responder community. We have a large number of medical research communities going on. We have first responders. We have emergency rooms. We have everything that society has. And so in that way, we're a microcosm. And one advantage the city of San Diego has is our ability to work together. San Diego is somewhat unprecedented in this, and this has been pointed out in a number of pieces, how San Diego is somewhat unique in our ability to work across disciplinary boundaries. And so for that reason, a number of people within the university felt that this was also important for us to do, is to approach this as a regional response, taking our specific toolkits, which is the purpose of today's presentations, and to integrate them and to extend beyond the university boundaries. And that's what you'll hear today is from the individuals who are representatives of groups of people and faculty, students, researchers who do this sort of research at UC San Diego and how it fits into the general umbrella of Homeland Defense. Then finally, and my last point here that I would like to make is my own perspective as a research scientist rather than as a dean or an organizer of this, and that's my own research is involved with aerosols. And I began in this world of aerosols because of the issues with health. This is a major issue for human health. There are 60,000 deaths a year from respiration of aerosols. It's important in the region. It's an increasing problem. It's a fundamentally interesting problem, and one of the more interesting issues is the issue of sources. You've all read about the haze that comes across the Pacific Ocean into San Diego, and this led me to start thinking in terms of bioterrorism. What does it mean in terms of detection of such aerosols? What are they? Where do they come from? How are they transported? How can they be detected? How fast can they be detected? What can be transported? What can't be transported? What's being measured? What isn't being measured? What are the limits in the technology in this? And so from my own perspective, this is an interest that relates in one small way to Homeland Security, because this is of obvious interest in terms of what might be out there, what might be a threat, and what we do, and in terms of people who develop first response, who develop strategy, who develop policy. There's an integration that needs to occur, and that's why it's important to take a small perspective, in this case my own research in atmospheric aerosol chemistry and transport, but related to the larger issue, which is Homeland Security, which means integration across boundaries that normally wouldn't be a connection that I would make. My own research in doing this, I would normally be going to the American Geophysical Union and talking to other people in geochemistry and geophysics and chemistry, but not necessarily to people who are interested in first response or making strategy. And that's what's different post-September 11th for all of us. And not only at the University of California, but also the people sitting out there listening to this. And so in today's presentation, you're going to hear from these groups of faculty in terms of what they're doing, and this is the overall perspective of how it will fit together. And I'd like to introduce the next speaker, who is someone who is engaged in atmospheric research and detection, actually, of different agents. This is Jamie Link from the Division of Physical Sciences, who will tell you about the development of smart dust and how it's used to detect biological and chemical attacks. And thank you again for coming here.
So in the chemistry department and the Sailor Lab, we're working on developing several technologies for sensing in conjunction with UCSD's efforts toward homeland defense. For example, we've developed sensors for explosives like TNT and DNT. We've developed sensors for chemical warfare agents such as sarin gas, and also sensors for broad classes of molecules like pollutants. In this first slide, you can see this is one of our sensing technologies for sensing TNT. The sensing element in this case is a polymer. It's like a silicon nanowire, and in the presence of UV light, the polymer glows green. However, when this polymer comes in contact with a molecule of TNT or DNT, the luminescence of this polymer is quenched and the polymer goes black. So what you see in this illustration is a piece of paper coated with this polymer and a handprint. The left handprint is a glove which has been brushed with TNT, and the right handprint is a clean hand. So you can see very clearly this is a nice visual cue for the presence of explosives. In the second slide, this is our Sarin Gas Detector. I brought along one of these models very similar to the one in the picture. You can see it's a handheld device. It's battery operated. It runs on a 9-volt battery, and it can run for several weeks on this 9-volt battery. The sensing component in this box is the chip shown on the right of this slide. What we do is we do specific chemistry on this chip, which was developed in conjunction with Bill Trogler, also in the chemistry lab, so that the sensor element specifically bonds to sarin gas. And so with this technique, we were able to detect sarin gas in the part per million range. And one of our next efforts was to miniaturize those sensors and to see how small of a sensor element we could make and still retain the functionality of the original parent chip. So this project took the form of developing this new material, which we call smart dust. And that's what you see on the left and at the bottom of this screen. The term smart dust was originally coined by Chris Pister at UC Berkeley. And it refers to any device or sensing element which has full autonomy and which is also on the size order of a particle of dust. And so I have a vial of this smart dust here. You can see it also on the slide. These are micron-sized particles, and we do the same chemistry on these particles that we do in the larger sensors to specifically bind types of molecules. So what we wanted to do, we also realized we could encode these particles with a specific barcode. So we wanted to create a barcode. In the optical spectrum, this barcode just looks like a series of lines and spaces, very much like a barcode you would see on a cereal box in a grocery store. And so we're able to probe this optically, and we can also read these barcodes at a distance of 20 meters using a laser. So we wanted to combine this encoding capability along with our sensing technologies in a project we did with Sangeeta Bhatia in the bioengineering department. And in this project, we created a large bioarray of a range of sensors, all with a unique barcode. And this is useful for high throughput screening applications in which we can identify an unknown agent against a large library of compounds. Also, you can see that the particles are very light. These are just in water, and you can see that they hover. So you can imagine dispersing these particles in a cloud to identify an unknown chemical agent, or painting these on the outside of an oil pipe in order to detect a leak, for example. And then probably most importantly, these particles are very, very biocompatible. So there should be a range of applications for in vivo diagnostics. And we also impart a large or a high degree of redundancy into these particles when we create them. So even though these particles may degrade over time in the body, we would still be able to read out the barcode even if over 50% of the structure were degraded. Thanks. And the next speaker is Sam Bosetti.
Hi, I'm Sam Bosetti. I'm from the Department of Medicine in the medical school, and I have the privilege of helping coordinate the regional network's work on bioterrorism research. The idea here is to take public safety, public health, military health, and healthcare system providers and link them with the research enterprise up on La Jolla Mesa. Now, the biomedical research machine here is probably unique in the history of the world. There is $1 billion in NIH and other government funding and $1 billion in private funding spent on health-related research in this area. And there are many important engines driving that work, but UCSD is probably the biggest of them. Health concerns, I think you've already gotten the feeling that health concerns and biomedical research sort of suffuse UCSD. The marine biologists at SIO, the people at the biological sciences divisions, the various informatics-related work, physical sciences, and where I work at the School of Medicine are all heavily involved in relevant research. I'm going to give you just a few areas. It's impossible really to describe this in any detail, but let me give you a few examples to try and illustrate for you the range of things that are being undertaken. And that range is really the entire universe of interest, I think. There is important work on mechanisms of disease. Work on mechanisms of disease is essential in order to know what to detect and where to intervene. You've seen some information on how anthrax, work done at UCSD on how anthrax attacks the body's defense mechanisms, important cellular mechanisms. The new dean of research at the medical school does similar work on the family of organisms that cause plague. And other investigators here are doing similar work on the body's response and the attack strategies of other Class A organisms. In the area of diagnosis, there's a lot of work on detecting products and detecting the body's response, unique responses to exposure to toxin and to infections to try and improve early detection. In the area of therapy, there's a lot of work on identifying targets and some work on campus in developing actually new agents. Most notably, I think people have seen press on the development of oral therapy for smallpox. The This new oral drug is not only the first orally available drug in history, but it's substantially more potent and substantially less toxic than the intravenous form. And so for the first time, it looks like the chemoprophylaxis, drugs to prevent smallpox after exposure, and drugs to treat smallpox may be possible. Moving to the area of health systems and policy, our own group's policy model on smallpox vaccination has been briefed really to a large number of government officials and advisory groups, and we're quite certain that the final administration policy on smallpox vaccination will reflect some of the findings that I'm not able to share in entirety with you. But I do think that it's safe to say that smallpox vaccination, at least of some targeted individuals, will almost certainly be undertaken in the United States, as it is being undertaken in other countries again. And finally, back to the idea of working with the community and immediately effective products. Our group in the medical school has worked with the Supercomputer Center, with KLIT Squared, with the first responders, all of whom are represented here, to try and help improve the flow of essential medical information during times of disasters, such as in a biological or chemical attack, a system to link the first responders with information on the nature of the attack, to link them to their managers, with the transportation systems, with the hospitals, and with the patients themselves, so that medical information will follow the victims to the field treatment stations and out to the hospitals. Something that I think probably would not have happened previously, because it does require, and it has required, integration of elements of the medical school, physicians, informaticians, first responders, both health responders and public safety responders. So I think that you're going to hear a lot more detail from a lot of individuals, but I best sit down so that I don't exceed my 5 minutes at this point, and be happy to talk a little more about any of the work that I mentioned during this time.
The next group of people that you will hear from concern the issue of cybersecurity, and the first speaker will be Tom Perrine from the San Diego Supercomputer Center, who will tell you about the internet and whether or not it's a terrorist tool or a target.
Actually, it's both. Just as we use it as a tool for education and research, so can anyone who chooses to use it to attack us. As far back as 1995, the idea of critical infrastructure in the United States was recognized, and there was a presidential commission on critical infrastructure protection. And at that time, they identified these sectors as being essentially the life support systems of the United States. Government services, banking and finance, electrical power, distribution, transportation, water, and emergency services, oil and gas, all of the things that we depend on for our day-to-day way of life. And as this analysis proceeded, we discovered over and over again that we kept running into this thing called telecommunications and the internet, because increasingly it is the sector that sits at the center of all the other sectors, and it is the sector that provides services that are used by all of the other sectors for control and monitoring and coordination. So the internet, telecoms, it's definitely a critical infrastructure piece, and we've been looking at this for a while. We just didn't realize exactly what the urgency was. At that time, we were looking at foreign governments, we were looking at lone hackers, you know, the stereotypical 14-year-old kid in a bedroom, and we didn't really realize that other people were ready to use this today. So the internet as a tool, it really is, it's connected to all of the other infrastructures. It's the pervasive underlayerment of all of these others. And it's important to mention that even though there's been a lot of discussion about using the internet to attack physical resources, things as the power grid, gas pipelines, or dams, to date, there's not been a single confirmed incident anywhere on the planet that shows injury or loss of life due to an attack over the internet. Now, does that mean that these things can't happen? Well, no, it doesn't. It just means they haven't happened yet, and it means that we're in the same situation we were with Y2K. Y2K, that was the most boring New Year's I can remember as far as security incidents, as far as disruptions of service, and people said, well, see, that was a big hoopla. There was nothing there. We spent all this money and there was nothing there. Well, the reason there was nothing there, the reason we did have a problem is because we spent all that money. And it's the same situation now with protecting critical infrastructure. We would like to have a nice, quiet, no incidents. So even though it has not been seen, it is possible to cause disruption or damage if the control systems are connected to the internet. These are the so-called SCADA systems, SCADA. These are the command and data acquisition systems for dams and things. The one incident that we have seen that has actually gotten a fair amount of press was in the Australian hacker, who actually turned out he was a disgruntled ex-employee of the water treatment facility, got into their wireless network and caused overflow of sewage into some local tourist beaches. So far, that's about as far as it's gone, and it doesn't look like it's really going to be a significant problem soon. However, on the other side, we know that attackers have used the internet to research vulnerabilities. We know that people have been looking at web pages for water treatment, the U.S. power grid in the United States, especially in California, and we know that people have been looking at the website that tells you everything that you would ever want to know about the Alaskan oil pipeline. Those, people looking at that information, that's in the logs for anyone to see, and why should we be surprised? We put it out there for people to see. We just didn't have the idea that people would use it to attack us. Another part that we have to think about is economic or information warfare, and this is using the internet to generate public uncertainty or maybe even do price manipulation stocks. Consider that the electrical power grid, the price fluctuations that we all saw in California last year, there's an online auction that occurs every few hours, and all the providers and the suppliers and the consumers all bid for how much power they need and how much they're willing to pay for power and how much power is going to charge. And I think that would be a very good place, if I were wearing a black hat, to go start and poking at our economic system. The quality and credibility of information on the internet is incredibly variable. Internet meets real world. CNN.com, speaking of real media, CNN.com saw their traffic load double every 7 minutes until their network capacity was exhausted. Why? Because everybody in the world wanted news. And where do you go for news when your local station isn't showing what you want? You go to online media. When the online media folds, when the UK news media folds, when news.com folds, where do you go? You go to CNN. At one point, they saw their traffic hit 20 times their normal traffic. They were serving 143 million hits a second before they folded under the network traffic. That kind of traffic is not difficult to generate. People now depend on the internet, financially, stock trading. This shows the internet meeting the real world. This is, we talked about Kevin Mitnick. He's old news, but he's not that old news. Takedown.com is a website that was put up to provide information about Kevin Mitnick and the case against him and what he had alleged to have done. And this shows the quietest New Year's that we'd ever had. This is a graph of the people trying to break into this website on a daily basis through December and January. And you can see that there are these big spikes when the media had an event. It was the quietest New Year's we'd ever had. School started, we saw this big probe of 55. CBS had a press release saying that they were going to interview him, and then the day he was released, we'd had more attempts to break into this machine than we had had in the prior 3 years. So this shows that the internet and the real world are connected, and that's what I had to say.
Hi, in the next 5 minutes I'm supposed to tell you about network security research at Ucsd, which is essentially an impossible task. We have a wide variety of work going on. We're leaders in cryptography. We're probably the world leaders in development of technologies for tracing attacks to their source, secure coprocessors. So rather than go into all of that, I'm going to focus on one project which is joint between the Department of Computer Science and Engineering and the Supercomputer Center, really in analyzing quantitatively the kinds of threats that are out there on the internet today and understanding what kinds of responses are necessary in order to protect those systems. So the two kinds of situations I'm going to talk about are denial of service attacks and network worms that we've been doing research on for a while. Denial of service attacks occur when an attacker simply overwhelms some victim with a large number of spurious requests. The closest physical analogy I can come up with is if someone were to send you 100,000 pieces of junk mail. This would cause all kinds of problems. One, it'd be very hard for you to read your legitimate mail, and at the same time, it'd be very hard for the postman who is trying to lug this big bag on his back full of all this stuff. And that's essentially what happens on the internet when someone just sends hundreds of thousands or millions of packets at a particular host. It shuts down, as CNN.com did when it got lots of normal requests, or the highly publicized attacks against Amazon, Yahoo, and so forth. However, most of the information about these kinds of attacks is really relegated to a few anecdotal incidences, some surveys, or a great deal of hype. And so one of the goals of our research has been to provide a quantitative basis on understanding how big a threat it is, what kind of a threat it is, who gets targeted, and so forth. And so early last year, we finished what was the first really quantitative measurement study of denial of service attacks around the entire globe. And so the graph here represents the number of denial of service attacks going on across the entire internet globally at any given instant. So what we found is that over a given week, there are 3,000 to 4,000 attacks going on, between 30 and 60 attacks at any given instant, targeting a wide range of end host sites and individuals and government organizations and so forth, including a reasonable number that we're starting to target pieces of core network infrastructure, such as routers or name servers that everybody depends on. And as was referred to in the earlier talk, when you shut down the communications infrastructure, then people aren't able to avail themselves of any of the services they depend on the internet to provide. So the other thing I wanted to touch on really briefly is this problem of network worms. And there's been some press about this with some of these worms like Code Red and NIMDA. And really what differentiates worms from what we used to call computer viruses are that worms don't have a human in the loop. So a computer virus arrives in your email and it says something enticing, and maybe you open it and then it will choose to spread itself, and if you don't open it, it doesn't. And so really the rate of spread is gated by people opening their email and doing something. Worms operate in a very similar manner, but they don't require a human. So they infect the machine and then they go off independently and start infecting other hosts on the internet. And that change in the speed of growth leads to a qualitative difference in the magnitude of the threat. So we just finished an analysis of if you were to do something about network worms like Code Red or NIMDA that are able to take over hundreds of thousands of machines in a very short period of time, what are the requirements on the technology, simulating the way the internet really works, the way worms really spread? If you were to have any kind of responsive capability where you said, all right, I'm going to detect it, and then I'm going to deploy it, and I'm going to respond, what would I need to build? And the results we came up with were are somewhat challenging, and that is that really to do anything about this problem in a meaningful way, we are going to require technology that is deployed in a very widespread fashion. That is, at least 95% of the internet paths, or 40 of the top ISPs would have to deploy this on all of their systems. And we need to be able to identify a new attack, characterize it, communicate the information everywhere, and then respond automatically with no human intervention, probably in the small number of minutes. And the reason for that is that because there is no human in the loop, these attacks grow at a tremendous rate. It follows one of these epidemic growth curves, and very quickly it's too late. And so you really have to stop it at the beginning. Next slide. And so I just wanted to illustrate, this is a example of the Code Red worm as we measured it here at UCSD and how it grew across the world in infecting hosts over the course of about 18 hours. And so in the beginning, it starts to spread to a fairly small number of, a few hundred, a few thousand machines, but then very quickly it ramps up, and within the space of about 10 hours, the vast majority of the vulnerable machines, in this case, just shy of 400,000 machines were taken over. And unfortunately, what we now understand is that this worm, while innovative, is at the very slow end of the worms that we know how to develop. And so subsequent research has basically demonstrated that it's possible for you to build a worm such as this that can take over many millions of machines in far under an hour. And that's all I have.
The next subdivision in this presentation is on critical infrastructure, and it's a pleasure to introduce my decanal colleague, Frieder Seibel from the Jacobs School of Engineering, and tell you something about new techniques in protection of building and bridges.
Thanks, Mark. We heard about the cyber infrastructure. Now I want to talk to you about the physical infrastructure and the terrorist attacks on the physical infrastructure and what we can do to protect our physical infrastructure. We're talking about the protection of buildings, bridges, dams, pipelines, transmission systems, and so on. Before 9/11, we did already significant research, but it was focused outside of this country. It was a big program we were working on to retrofit or harden our embassy buildings worldwide against terrorist attacks. Okay, and this is a picture up in the top left of the U.S. Embassy in Athens in Greece. It's a 1958 Walter Gropius designed building, so it's an architectural landmark. And the solution at the time was to build a 30-foot high wall around the entire embassy to protect it against terrorist attack. Clearly neither the inhabitants of the embassy or the people in Athens liked that idea, and so we looked at other possible measures to harden or retrofit that particular structure. Now, since 9/11, clearly the problem has come much closer to home. As you can see in the bottom right, we are talking about the security of especially landmark structures which make prime targets for terrorists because they will have a big impact when they get damaged or destroyed. Next slide. We have been working already for the last 3 years with DTRA, that's the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, to essentially transfer technology which we developed in the Powell Structural Research Laboratories here at UCSD for seismic retrofitting of structures to strengthen buildings and bridges against earthquakes, to transfer some of that technology for the terrorist loading case, namely to harden structures against terrorist attacks. Next. We have a 5-story full-scale research building at White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico, which we blow up on a regular basis to test different retrofit measures. And then the next slide. Since this is not always very economical to blow up a full-scale building every time, we want to try different measures for column retrofits or wall or slab retrofits. We also built a separate test stand at Kirtland Air Force Base in New Mexico, as you see here, for the testing of individual columns. So this is just one of these blast tests which we do on individual components at Kirtland Air Force Base. Here you can see the effect of one of these blast tests on the individual column. You can see the column is deformed by about a foot, okay? It doesn't carry a vertical load anymore. When we wrap the same column with technology we developed for seismic retrofit with advanced composite materials, just a few layers of carbon fibers, and then we repeat that same blast test, the same blast load, the same standoff distance, you see the effect on the right-hand side, namely a column which is perfectly straight after the test, okay, and shows no damage at all, okay. So we have developed technologies which are very effective for retrofit. For example, for the embassy in Athens would be just stripping off all the marble cladding on the concrete columns, wrapping them with carbon fibers, putting marble cladding back on. There's absolutely no impact on the architectural statement Walter Gropius wanted to make, and the building is hardened against terrorist attack. Next slide. We're working on other critical infrastructure applications, bridges. We had several threats here in California against our local landmark bridges, the Golden Gate Bridge, other major bridges in California. And we're working very closely with the U.S. Navy and with Caltrans on developing retrofit strategies to mitigate terrorist attacks on our bridges, in particular the cable-supported bridges, protection of cables and cable systems by wrapping the cables with special materials. And then again, we're doing large-scale or full-scale blast tests with the U.S. Navy. On the right-hand side, you can see a system of movable barriers, which when a particular threat has been issued, that you can put movable blast barriers out to protect the structure, to protect the population. Okay. Right now, we have 300-foot standoffs at all of our airports. Okay. All our parking spaces have been cut off. When you go to the airport, you see all these empty parking spaces, and you're very frustrated because you can't find parking. Hopefully, with some of this technology, we'll be able to move some of the barriers a little bit closer to the building and regain some of our parking spaces. Next slide. And finally, the last project I wanted to briefly mention is the use of multi-use sensor networks for the protection of our infrastructure. Right now, we're working from the civil structural side on outfitting most of our critical structural systems with sensors for us to determine the health of the structure. How far is the structure deteriorated? How much service life do we have in our structure? When do we need to repair or retrofit structural systems? We can use similar sensors for security applications too. For example, in the middle you see a big rubber bearing. We just outfitted the entire Coronado Bridge with rubber bearings for seismic. Okay, so the entire bridge is now put on soft rubber bearings, which are on top of the pier under the superstructure. So in case of an earthquake, the pier will move and the bridge stays in place up on top, and you won't virtually not feel the earthquake on top of the bridge. So we want to monitor the deformations in these rubber bearings from a structural point of view. So we can deploy digital video cameras, and then with the same camera we can monitor the main shipping channel under the Coronado Bridge for the U.S. Coast Guard, and we can monitor the Navy assets in the various Navy docks in the San Diego harbor. And then using pattern recognition software, we can determine when small craft get too close to one of our Navy ships, for example. And we don't have to monitor these things visually, but we can do it fully automated. So with that, that was what I wanted to show you. And next we'll have a little video clip from Professor Mohan Trivedi in the Electrical and Computer Engineering Department, who couldn't be with us today, on smart vision projects to detect terrorist activities.
What I wanted to share with you are give you an overview of a couple, three projects which are sponsored in our laboratory, directly focused on Homeland Security effort. After September 11th, our colleagues at SPAWAR, as well as ourselves, we responded to a call out of the Office of Naval Research, the Chief Scientist's Office, to put together a distributed interactive video array specifically designed for monitoring the activities on our coastline, where we will be able to look at the vehicle traffic, the personnel traffic, as well as the traffic which is associated with the sea or ocean crafts. And it's a pretty ambitious project, and basically we want to come up with an architecture which would be looking at approximately 4 miles up and down the Pacific coast in Point Loma, and develop an intelligent blanket, so to say. So any suspicious activities would be recorded, as well as if we want to investigate, the system would be smart enough to come up with the right pan, tilt and zoom on its own to record and give you a closer view of that particular event. Another project was initiated just a couple, 3 months ago with the sponsorship from CCAT, the Center for Commercialization of Advanced Technology, which is actually a Defense Department sponsored activity involving multiple agencies in the community. And for this particular project, our focus on developing tools which would be useful for the first responders when there is an emergency situation. So what we have done is we have developed what we like to call a digital secure televiewer. And in this particular situation, the idea is that we would have coverage of some of the sites, public spaces, like airports, like freeway interchanges, where things, emergency is something that we may want to monitor. At the client end, where people might be holding their PDAs, and these could be police officers, these could be people who are driving ambulances, people who are fire personnel, and they want to get a pretty good look of how this particular site appears from wherever they are very quickly by choosing their own customized perspective and customized resolution of these events at the remote site. I want to point out that these projects that we are working on, although they are research projects, but they are on a very aggressive time schedule. We are interested, working with our sponsors, on developing systems which can be demonstrated, evaluated, and finally actually productized on a 12 to 18 month time frame. So it's a pretty aggressive time frame. And one other project that I want to mention is something which really came out of an initiative that President Bush announced last November, where he basically asked the Office of the Secretary of Defense to start calling for new ideas from all over, which are focused directly on counter-terrorism and homeland security. And we were fortunate that in that particular competition, which was a 3-level competition, the project that we had proposed on automatic face detection systems did actually win. And now we are about to start this one-year activity. And in this particular project, our focus is on developing computer-based algorithms where you can analyze images or videos of complicated scenes, but very quickly and very reliably pick up all the faces. No matter what is in the background, no matter what kind of a lighting they have, whether it is indoor or outdoor, or no matter what is really the resolution. Thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to share with you an overview of some of the research projects that we are engaged in on the Homeland Security front.
Our next speaker is John Cosmico from the Jacobs School of Engineering. John.
Thank you. There is currently a strong interest to try to develop unmanned aircraft that can be used for patrolling, monitoring, detection, and inspection. These aircraft are generally take on one of two forms. Either they can be an unmanned vehicle which is piloted and controlled by a person on the ground, or it can be a fully autonomous vehicle. By fully autonomous, we mean the plane will take off by itself. It'll be programmed to fly to specific GPS coordinate locations. It will then go ahead and monitor, perform its mission, and then return and land by itself, ready to be launched again. An example of the first type, which is an unmanned aircraft which is pilot controlled from the ground, is a Predator aircraft developed locally here in San Diego by General Atomics Aeronautic Systems. That is a very well-known airplane, has been used very successfully in military applications, and my students and I have worked closely with them to develop the composite structure for this aircraft, as well as to recently develop the system which is used to mount the small UAVs, the mini UAVs that hang under the wing. The idea being is that when the airplane is in flight, the mini UAVs could be dropped to perform a separate mission. Examples of these missions could include being able to detect with infrared cameras either lost people, hostage situations, or even in fires, basically determine the hot spots of fires where you could effectively then have an air attack dropped in order to drop any type of solvent you want to use to put out the fire. Another of examples of autonomous vehicles are the Aerosound and then the Kestrel. The Aerosound is a vehicle that we're looking at. It's a commercial vehicle that's out there, but we're interested in redeveloping it for a much longer application, basically longer flight times. And in that situation, we want to use it to monitor transmission lines, oil pipelines, things of that nature. Again, what would be built into that would be embedded sensors, vision cameras, and infrared. Examples of sensors could be for any type of sensing of any type of aerosols that are in the air. The Kestrel, the one you see on the bottom, is probably one of the more exciting ones. That's being developed by Honeywell. We're working with them on structural design and material applications. And basically what you see there is it has a horizontal type propeller system. So it takes off like a helicopter, then slightly pitches forward and flies in forward flight. Thereby being able to fly like a helicopter, it can effectively be used to monitor the structure of buildings and bridges. It can go look for people that would be trapped, can look for personnel situations. You could even use it for hostage type situations. Basically be able to monitor a site and see what's there. Next slide. What we've been developing at UCSD with my students for the last 4 years is we have developed an example of one is shown up top, 4 different unmanned air vehicles that we've used for international competitions. The last vehicle that we've designed and developed has won an international competition, and this summer what we've been doing is converting it over to a fully autonomous vehicle. One where, like I said, we could program the vehicle to take off, fly to specific GPS sites, perform its mission, come back and land. The idea is it could be used to, let's say, cruise up and down the coast, monitor the coast for any type of situation. The lower aircraft is a design that we're starting on now. We would like to have it fabricated this fall and winter and have it flyable by next spring. It's a much larger aircraft with a much higher aspect ratio. The idea is to use it for much longer flights, more of a sailplane or a glider as opposed to a typical aircraft. So it would have a motor for takeoff, but it would do mostly sailplane type applications for very long distance flying. Next slide. The final project, or the second project that I'd like to mention, is a project that we have sponsored with the Office of Naval Research. And this is on the development of advanced composite bridging, basically to replace bridging that would be used, bridging that would either be destroyed or bridging that would have been taken out in a military event. The whole idea with this, which is different than typical bridging, is that instead of manufacturing the bridge sections at a site and then shipping them by boat to a conflict site, the idea here is to ship the raw material. So we're shipping the fabric, the resin, and the tooling, and then the bridge sections are fabricated on site, thereby making it much quicker, and they're able to put in a bridge much faster and actually cheaper. The bridge sections are relatively light, so they can be dropped in place by helicopter. The 2 different designs we're looking at is one is a modular design on top, which could be used to cross large gorges or other types of canals. The culvert bridging, which is basically made of composite tubes, and in that situation the tubes are designed and placed in place, and then soil is compacted over the top to provide a temporary type bridging. This could also be used to basically take these modular type sections, and if in an event there needed to be one, we could drop a section on top of an existing bridge to replace the bridge and get it operational again. Okay, with that, I'd like to thank you, and I'd like to introduce my next speaker, Mr. Hodgkiss. Dr. Bill Hodgkiss.
My name is Bill Hodgkiss, and I'm from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. First slide, please. Amongst others at UCSD, SIO is engaged broadly in environmental sensing activities. Of course, as you'd expect, for us that includes the ocean and seafloor beneath the ocean, the chemical, biological, and physical processes all linked together in those media. But importantly, that also includes land processes and atmospheric processes. What we do naturally as scientists is to study these processes, and the sensors that we use for those purposes are equally as useful for studying environmental change as they are for studying insults to the environment created by man-made events. Next slide, please. The components of a sensor network, an environmental sensor network, are of course somewhat obvious. They include the sensors themselves and the telemetry to get the sensor data back to a place where you'd like to take advantage of that data. The point of this slide, or one of the points that I wanted to make here, is that we're very fortunate in Southern California to have the benefit of a couple of projects funded by the National Science Foundation, which have created infrastructure that enable us to do wireless telemetry history of the deployment of broad networks of environmental sensors. It's a first, and the slide, the right-hand slide portion of the slide is the topology of this network, is the HPREN, or High Performance Research and Educational Network. It's a National Science Foundation project with the principal investigators Hans Werner Braun from here at SDSC and Frank Vernon from SIO. The picture on the right is the topology of that network, which shows a 45 megabit wireless backbone across Southern California from San Diego on the lower left out towards Mount Woodson and the Salton Sea on the far eastern part of San Diego County, and then reaching north to Toro Peak in the upper right-hand corner and to the Santa Margarita Ecological Reserve on the upper left-hand corner of this figure. What the topology gives us the opportunity to do is to provide a high-speed internet or wireless network pathway for data from sensors deployed broadly across San Diego County. These are very broad in their types, from biological to chemical to seismic sensors, and the HPREN is providing that backbone where the sensors can telemeter their data back to San Diego. In addition, the HPREN is also an educational network, and although it's difficult to see on the slide, there are a number of Indian reservations in San Diego County, and the network is linking to those Indian reservations to provide internet connectivity to underserved portions of the county. All of those of you with cell phones recognize that once you get out of an urban environment, you're lucky if you have any communications at all, and if you do, it's via telephone, and the HPREN is providing a internet gateway backbone in this Southern California area for research and education purposes. The second project noted, called RoadNet, is also a National Science Foundation project. The lead principal investigator is John Orcutt at SIO, and also participating in this project are co-principal investigators Hans Werner Braun and Frank Vernon, amongst others. And the RoadNet is building on the HPREN network to deploy a whole variety of sensors throughout this region, including seismic sensors in the area around Anza, in hydrological sensors throughout the county, and also coastal ocean sensors on our coastal region. And so RoadNet and HPREN together provide an opportunity for deployment of sensors and doing research on those activities. The third item mentioned here, real-time data and information management, indicates as clearly as obvious that these data streams have to go somewhere, and so there's research being conducted as part of the RoadNet project here at SDSC in real-time management of those data streams and the mining of information from those real-time data streams. And then of course, once you turn data into information, you need people to be able to visualize it and react to it to make decisions, so there's a visualization component. Much of the work that we do in the area of environmental sensor networks is facilitated through the partnership with Cal IT Squared and Ramesh Rao. Our next speaker will talk a little bit more about the California Institute on Telecommunications and Information Technology. Next slide. The intent here is to just show an example of an end-to-end sensor through visualization. On the left-hand side is actually a picture from a Union Tribune article on the end of January that illustrates a coastal surface radar system called a CODAR. The intent here is that there will be one of these units placed on Point Loma, right at Imperial Beach and on the Coronados, and the surface scattering radar will provide a picture of what the surface current is like in that region that's slightly crosshatched in the right-hand side of that picture. And that picture is showing essentially the Coronados, IB, and Point Loma. Essentially, in conjunction with the surface radar, by using water column in situ sensors, we'll be able to develop a sense of the circulation patterns in this area from IB on north up through the Point Loma area to understand better the fate of pollutants and other particulate matter in the coastal ocean. This particular project, the CODAR project, was done in a unique fashion with the City of Imperial Beach as providing the funding, and through participation of Eric Terrell and others at SIO. And the data from that system will be telemetered via wireless network back to SIO. I should say also that the sensing network will be expanded into Mexico with colleagues of ours who will establish one of these CODAR sites in the vicinity of Rosarita Beach to provide even further coverage of the circulation pattern south of the border several miles. So once you have data like this and work on analyzing it to gain information of the circulation patterns, eventually you want to look at it and make conclusions as to the origin and fate of pollutants and other particulate matter in the water. And on the right-hand side is an illustration of a new visualization center that we've established at SIO with significant matching funds from Cal IT Squared. The Immersive Visualization Center is involves a screen that's on the order of about 20 feet long and about 8 feet tall, and provides a multi-megapixel way of visualizing data and information in an immersive sense, so that several people at the same time can be experiencing the same scene. The idea, of course, is that to make appropriate decisions in both scientific data as well as emergency response situations, you need many people to look at the same information and then be able to talk about what they're seeing. This will give us the opportunity to explore this. This visualization center has been up and running now for several months, and importantly, it's also linked to a similar facility at San Diego State University optically, so that we can optically share the same visual scene both at UCSD and at SDSU and explore being able to do interactive network visualization between the two. So in summary, across sensor networks, environmental sensor networks in particular, we're looking at all aspects of both the sensors themselves, wireless telemetry of the data, data mining, turning data into information, and lastly, visualization of that data. Thank you. And the next speaker is Ramesh Rao. He's the San Diego Director of the California Institute for Telecommunications and Information Technology. Ramesh.
Thanks, Bill. So I should mention that I've been a professor here at UCSD in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering, working on wireless communications. And what I thought I would do in the 5 minutes I have is focus on wireless and telecommunications technologies that relate to Homeland Defense, among other things. We set out, when we wrote the Cal IT Squared proposal, to accomplish a number of things, and our tagline was to take the internet into the physical world. And post 9/11, that has taken on added significance. And there are new partnerships, new activities that are underway that deliver on that promise. And sort of to step back a little bit and walk you through what's happening right now and what's over the horizon. There's some exciting new technologies that are becoming available in the licensed band systems. These are cellular systems that companies, service providers paid lots of money for. And from my perspective, from our perspective of using IT and wireless in support of Homeland Defense, what's remarkable is the data rates that you can support. It's becoming more and more realistic to do video transmissions, for example, over these cellular technologies. And this leads to a whole slew of new applications with camera deployments around the physical infrastructure that you wish to protect. There's also interesting new technologies in the satellite domain that allow two-way satellite out of remote locations. Cellular systems work well in populated areas, but what about the unpopulated areas where you have assets that you wish to protect? Satellite seems to emerge as the clear choice there. But I think we've all been touched in recent months by this grassroots level guerrilla infrastructure deployment that's been taking place everywhere. This is the Wi-Fi 802.11 in its various flavors, B, A, and G in that order. We have significant new opportunities that open up, not so much from the point of view of providing connectivity for folks with laptops, but sensors that sit out there on batteries that are supposed to last for a long, long time, things that you could do by exploiting this low-cost, ubiquitous infrastructure that has emerged. But Wi-Fi is not the only one that lives in this unlicensed band. There's Bluetooth, there are other proprietary technologies, some of which are being very effectively put to work in the sensor net environment. Looking over the horizon, not too far away, we have a couple of new developments which I think are going to make a very significant impact. There's activity underway here at UCSD already. The first one I want to briefly touch upon is ultra-wideband. These are systems that if the proponents of the systems had their way, and if FCC would have provided the appropriate regulatory mechanisms for them to transmit signals over the bands and at the power levels they wanted to, you would be able to look through rubble and pick out a small beating heart. So these are technologies that combine elements of radar with high-performance communications. There was some partial progress made, ruling February 14th of this year, that makes it possible to do a little bit of this. But this is a technology that we have researchers in the Wireless Center here working on already that I think holds a lot of promise. Cognitive radios is along the same lines. These are radios which are able to sniff out the capabilities, you know, the availability of resources, spectrum, its usage, congestion, and things of that sort, and make the most in a very dynamic way. So late at night when all the TV stations stop transmission, maybe you can use the signals, the spectrum that was allocated to them to do some deep data downloads, you know, some heavy-duty data downloads, as an example of what you could do if you had cognitive radios. Some of these things push the envelope on how business has been done, and so yeah, these things don't happen as fast as you would like for it to. On to the next slide. Cal IT Squared was only the most recent example of partnerships that the university has been able to cultivate over a long period of time that helps us move and contribute to these developments. We have deep engagements with over 40 companies. I just want to call out a few from the perspective of wireless and communications and recognize the kinds of partnerships that we have in place. With Qualcomm, we have had a prototypical high-performance wireless data access to the internet system running on this campus for almost 18 months, and we are starting to take this into different spaces. With Ericsson, which has a strong San Diego presence, we've been working on efforts to do a little bit of what I said about cognitive radios, but at the system level. So if you are in a particular location and you find that there's half a dozen different ways in which you can get on the internet, how do you seamlessly make the most of it? We have activities underway with Ericsson in that regard. In the unlicensed band, a significant partner that we have is Intersil. They basically rule the 802.11b space in many ways. And we also have two San Diego-based companies, Silicon Wave and Widcom, that are in the Bluetooth space, which I had alluded to earlier. Going down the list, Hughes Network Systems, another San Diego company that has made deep contributions in the satellite space, and what lies ahead is extraordinarily high-performance systems that can do spot beams that can support gigabit per second rates directly from the mobile terminal. We also have activities on this campus that you perhaps heard of and read about, the Active Campus effort, which will soon have 800 students wandering around campus with PDAs from HP that make it possible to really test how these things work when you have a large-scale deployment. In my final slide, I just want to list as many as we could fit on that one slide, examples of projects that are underway. There's probably 10 times as many with different degrees of overlap, and we'll hear in a little bit more detail later on from Dr. Dunford about one of those efforts. But let me just pick on two in the interest of time. with Dr. Leonard, we partnered in Cal IT Squared and a number of other units on campus to create a system and prototype it that would allow us to manage what you would have to deal with if there was, let's say, a biochemical attack in a public space like the Qualcomm Stadium. So you have 30,000 individuals who have perhaps been exposed to some kind of hazardous material. What do you do? How do you track them? You don't want them showing up at the hospital. You want to understand, revisit your triage decisions. And part of what we wanted to do, one small part of that was to build these sensors that you might want to snap onto the fingertips of the folks that have been exposed to this and be able to monitor their health. Okay, this is pulse ox. Very basic information that we learned through our discussions with folks in the first responder community makes a big difference. These instruments are very expensive. They cost many thousands of dollars. The goal is to make it so cheap that this can be thrown away. And so finding ways to extract that data and put it over a .11b infrastructure, which is commonplace, which is very low cost and we are all familiar with, is an example of something very concrete and very specific we are doing there. Let me then pick the one that we have below that. I alluded to how you can do video over cellular systems today. With Dr. Pat Lydon in the Stroke Center, we have an effort underway that would allow experts to be able to project their abilities, their capabilities to cover a larger area where they could be examining patients really close in. You've heard telemedicine talked about for a long time, but what's different now is that the data rates are finally there, so you can begin to do stuff that was impossible in the past. So I think I better stop here.
Good morning. I'm Jim Dunford. I'm an emergency physician. I'll be working at 5 this evening. Hopefully I won't meet any of you at my workplace. I'm also the City of San Diego's EMS medical director and a professor in the School of Medicine. If we've learned anything from 9/11, I think it's that the communications is a critical thing if we're going to run a mass casualty situation, and some of the things that we're still learning about in terms of the World Trade Center that made communications infrastructure come undone are things that we're really trying to make big progress for in our first responders. And what I'm going to talk about briefly is the first responder system, remembering that first responders can be firefighters, they can be paramedics, they can be police officers, they can be primary care physicians and emergency physicians in this community. They all form a part of the bioterrorist, chemical and conventional attack first response force. Also, I am going to briefly talk a little bit about a project called Wizard, which is an exciting grant, federal grant that the university, Cal IT Squared, and a number of the research community, public and private and military in this community have put out, which is a very exciting prospect for us. First slide actually shows two paramedics talking to each other. This project is one that we call TAP charts, and it in its own right is a very exciting concept that the City of San Diego paramedic system is currently implementing. This is a palm-based handheld system, which is one of the first real electronic medical record-keeping systems in the country. It is going to have unparalleled ability to collect data and be able to transmit that information to hospitals and to store it, collect it, and analyze it. And although this is not a wireless version, it's very easy to imagine that it can be in the next generation. Next slide. The incident command system is an important concept of disaster preparedness. It was created in the 1970s by the fire service, and it's been adopted widely at this time. Basically what it says is the fire captain at this rescue traffic accident needs to know ahead of time that everybody who is arriving at that scene knows exactly what they're supposed to do before they get there, and that he can build on that system quickly so that if he needs additional resources, those resources will be available to him or her. We plan for these kinds of events. As everybody knows, the Super Bowl will be here in January, and it's probably one of the premier events in the country that requires a unified command system. San Diego has become expert at dealing with unified command, again, coordinating FBI, police, sheriff, fire, EMS in one organizational chart that's scalable to any size of emergency. Next slide. The technologies, on the other hand, that we use to try to run those systems are still designed in the 19th and 20th century. They're pens and pencils, they're 800 megahertz radios, they're disaster triage tags that are paper and fall apart. And there are a lot of problems in terms of running a large-scale incident, and we're talking, again, in terms of potential for tens of thousands of individuals in a worst-case scenario. Those are situations where patients can't move from the scene and go to the hospitals. Next slide. Just to name a few of the communication problems that would basically occur in such calamity. First, victims flee. Oftentimes, before hospitals can be alerted, they have contaminated victims upon them. status of patients change. As many as 30% of patients are initially mistriaged as we go rapidly through the triage process of trying to separate the sick from the non-sick. It's difficult, as we all know, to track the location and the clinical status of the first responders themselves. The destinations of the patients, where are they going, is oftentimes hard to find. Tags can be lost, etc. Hospital resource information. The incident commander oftentimes doesn't really have a really great idea of what the capacity is of the local regional hospitals. Next slide. WIZARD, the Wireless Information System, has a long acronym. I won't go into it, but basically WIZARD is a wonderful concept that was created, again, in partnership between the university, both the School of Medicine, the School of Engineering, Cal IT Squared, and many other providers, that would create the first 21st century wireless information system for the incident commander at the scene. It would bring the incident commander patient monitoring and tracking capabilities that really don't exist at this time. Field care data, in other words, what's been done to the patient, can be stored and transferred on to hospitals, and innumerable potentials that can grow out of this research project, which we hope to hear optimistically from the federal government this coming October. Essentially, it's a wireless internet system. It has mobile characteristics to it, and San Diego is in a unique position to be able to accomplish this 21st century information system for disaster preparedness. Next slide. Two other brief points. Hospitals in the past, quite honestly, really gave lip service to disaster preparedness, and 9/11 was a wake-up call. The Hospital Emergency Incident Command System has been put in place by essentially all of the hospitals in San Diego at the urging of the Health Services Department of California. It now provides job descriptions for everybody in the hospital. They know what they're to do in the event of an emergency, and basically links hospitals with the EMS system so that there's one centrally unified command system. Last slide. And lastly, I mentioned that physicians and other healthcare providers are part of the first responder system, and that really pertains mostly to bioterrorism. San Diego County can be congratulated for putting together what's called the Emergency Medical Alert Network, which is a website which provides all the critical information that first responders of the healthcare variety would need. And I just can list a couple here. Basically, bioterrorism websites, 24/7 telephone numbers that allow physicians to be able to report, because in a bioterrorist event, it's sentinel reporting and quick tracking that's going to determine the difference. It's not a lights and sirens response when a bioterrorist event occurs. And also emerging diseases like West Nile virus. So it's a wonderful web-based tool for the community that's now available by subscription, but also for non-subscription use as well. That's www.emansandiego.org.
The last area of research on the campus in general I'd like to introduce is public policy, and Aaron Keneally from the San Diego Supercomputer Center will tell you about some of the efforts.
Good morning. I just wanted to briefly address some of the issues regarding computer security and measuring computer security and the threat involved there, and basically, in a nutshell, talk about bridging the policy-technology divide. The framework underlying San Diego Supercomputer Center Homeland Security Research and Development is essentially the same framework that underlies computer security research efforts, and that's basically efforts to enhance risk protection, detection, and response capabilities. This technology development is occurring in the context of our national strategy to secure our homeland. And it answers the question actually answers the call for expanded data collection and analysis in order to share and consolidate risk-related data. The result of this is we're dealing with a dichotomy in that tools can be used as both enablers and disablers. From an enabling standpoint, this research and development and these tools are enhancing the single point of collection of this data to provide protection, detection, and response capabilities. From the disabling standpoint, however, it's also increased the ability to allow government to conduct surveillance on our citizens, and it also, if fallen into the wrong hands, can empower damage-seeking deviants. So insofar as our law and policy is precipitated by the use of this technology, whether it be by the government, digital miscreant, first responders, or law enforcement, there are social and policy concerns that arise out of the use of this technology that we are developing here. And this is especially important in the context of the ambiguity and uncertainty about the privileges and the rights to deploy this technology. A big example here is the heightened privacy and security debate that permeates our society today. Our privacy concerns are related to abuse of information, and that's facilitated by the proliferation of such things as computer log files and massive customer databases. It's also driven by increased law enforcement ability to access and mine these public databases in order to look for quote-unquote suspicious activity, which is a mutable term. So to the extent that technology implicates legal regulations, we as researchers bear responsibility to design our technologies and our tools with this policy in mind. Recognizing that these tools can be both enablers and disablers depending on who is employing the technology, to the extent that we are capable, we should design these tools to minimize the ease with which they can be used as disablers. How can we do that? We can do that by ensuring the integrity and the reliability of the data that we capture and collect. We can also do that by building accountability in the prevention, detection, and response tools. And this is even more important given the ease with which digital data can be altered in undetectable ways. This is just a news story that exemplifies a reason why we need responsible research. We need to look at how reliable is the data that's underlying our policies. Right now, anecdotal, self-serving survey data is basically what permeates our risk analysis infrastructure, and we need to be responsible about making sure that the data that we're providing to law enforcement and first responders and whatnot is reliable and that it doesn't fall into the hands of damage-seeking social deviants. So mindful of this need for reliable data, the San Diego Supercomputer Center's security research is aimed at measuring the actual risk, empirical measurements of the risk, and specifically in two areas, both the external risk and internal vulnerabilities. Without transparent and repeatable measurements, the public and private responses will be based on misperceived risks, inaccurate security assurances, and it threatens to institutionalize poor practices and policies. With these benefits in hand, with these measurements in hand, I should say, the benefit is that policymakers and business leaders can better incentivize the protection, detection, and response capabilities. And finally, this slide here is just a little illustration of one of our efforts to quantify and empirically measure the risk that the operators of our information technology infrastructure pose to our critical infrastructure. Basically, what we're doing here is applying forensics to uncover fingerprints of operators. We're used to using forensics to basically replay what an attacker has done on our systems. Well, we're turning that around and using forensics to tell us to look at the machines and have the machines tell us what operators are doing instead of relying on survey data. From that point, we'd like to compare these patterns of operational practices to best practice templates, whatever that means, and part of the research is helping to refine and define what best practices are. At that point, we develop statistical profiles of those operating practices, aggregate those profiles across any number of industries. For example, if you want to see how our banking industry is operating from a security standpoint in the information technology area, that would be one application. And then finally, and most importantly, we need to correlate these patterns to actual loss events. So the bottom line here is if we're able to quantify our internal risk, we will better know our weaknesses, and at that point we can then move our assets and our critical infrastructures away from those weaknesses and away from those external threats. Thank you. And our last speaker to wrap it up is Peter Cowie.
My job is to take the discussion about the protection of Homeland Security and tie it to the work being done at UC San Diego about global security. The issue that we are facing today is essentially a replay, if you would, of the dialogue that we had after the tragic events of 9/11. You'll recall that 1 year ago, the discussion about foreign policy as a response to terrorism was a debate about whether the Bush administration would pursue unilateralism or multilateralism. The response of the Bush foreign policy and defense team was very skillful, and they deserve full credit for it. They essentially segregated U.S. foreign policy into two tracks, one unilateral, the other multilateral. On the side of military security operations, most strongly exemplified by our actions in Afghanistan, they took a form of modified unilateralism. Basically, the United States told the world that it was going to intervene in Afghanistan, it would take the full brunt of responsibility for the military activities, and others could participate to the extent that they wanted to. But it also modified unilateralism in the sense that it strongly sought general support out of a UN resolution, and it consulted with its allies very strongly before it went into Afghanistan. So while everyone knew where the bottom line was, that the United States would intervene, there was a procedural process where others were brought in an inclusionary way. But the outcome was not in doubt. On the other hand, much of the activity against terrorism, in fact, if you would, 360 days of the 365-day-a-year struggle against terrorism is really in regards to intelligence and police activity. That is the key to an anti-terrorism strategy. And that strategy is truly multilateral. It has succeeded far more vigorously than many skeptics believed. And the story of Singapore is a good example of why it succeeded. Singapore represents a country that is highly sophisticated, but of course strongly dependent on its economic ties with the United States. After 9/11, the United States informally told the heads of states around the world of all key countries that this is when we were going to start counting who was with us and who was against us. And there could be expectations of seeing the displeasure of the United States if they didn't line up with us. But the second part of the story with Singapore, after hearing this message, was that Singapore did a very careful analysis of its own security situation and discovered, to its surprise, that it had active terrorist cells operating in Singapore that it had not previously detected. And this story was repeated throughout the world. And so as a result, police and intelligence services around the world have in fact developed a whole series of new protocols for cooperating with each other much more rapidly, effectively, and we're seeing, as we've seen this last week, numerous sorts of joint international police exercises against terrorist cells around the world. So multilateralism on the day-to-day hard work of intelligence and police work, unilateralism militarily. Next slide. Today, we face, again, the discussion about unilateralism and multilateralism. But this discussion, which has crystallized around the question of military action against Iraq, really faces a new set of wrinkles. And what I'd like to do today to illustrate the work that we've been doing at UCSD is to talk about a couple of those wrinkles. Any effort to divide the world for convenience's sake between unilateralism and multilateralism is, of course, faced in the long haul by the fact that the world is not so neatly tractable into these categories. And the action in Afghanistan exactly represents the sorts of problems that are posed by the long haul. After the military intervention in Afghanistan, the United States took an ambivalent position about nation building in Afghanistan. The international peacekeeping force essentially only operated in the central city of Kabul and one or two other large towns in Afghanistan. The result has been a slow deterioration of the countryside in Afghanistan and the beginnings of an implosion in the country. Afghanistan's a long way away from our key allies in Europe, so to some extent the Europeans kept a low-key tone about this. But they've been very worried about this, and if you'll notice in the last few weeks, the Bush administration is now allowing as to the fact that peacekeeping may have to be expanded in Afghanistan. Researchers from UCSD with their colleagues at Stanford and Columbia spent extensive time doing briefings in Washington, D.C. during this last year, predicting exactly this particular pattern of activity, because it was clear to us that without extensive peacekeeping and nation-building exercises, there was going to be deep trouble in Afghanistan, because that's been the story in every similar situation that we've seen in the last 50 years. In the debate about Iraq, there is, of course, a significant division of opinion about whether it is necessary to undertake military action against Saddam Hussein at this stage. But leaving aside that debate with our allies, a second debate is going on, and that is that the Europeans are saying, wait a second, Iraq is in our backyard. It's not on a distant corner of the world. It's not Afghanistan. And if you intervene in Iraq, you are going to be creating the potential for chaos in that particular part of the world that will touch immediately upon Iran, which is a key European interest, and Turkey, which is, of course, a partial member of the European Union. And as a result, the Europeans are really saying to the Bush administration, so you go in, so you intervene, and let's say you win. What happens next in Iraq? What are you committed to doing? And part of the effort of diplomacy right now is about what promises the United States will make about the rebuilding and stabilization of Iraq after military action, if that indeed is where we go in the future. Well, that's an example of how those categories don't work out so easily, because that rebuilding in Iraq will require a multilateral effort, and the Europeans know that they'll be there full and squarely as partners caught in the trap if there is not a successful stabilization of Iraq. Now, there's a second front to these efforts of building security in the long term. There's the effort to secure our basic critical infrastructure, as you've heard earlier in these press briefings. And there's the effort to deal with other parts of the economy, such as the security of the food chain, which is, in fact, at risk to terrorists. This is going to require, as you've heard time and again this morning, a careful rebuilding of our entire infrastructure, including our food production chain and distribution chain, in order to build security against terrorism. That is not solely a U.S. effort. It is a global effort that is going to take place in every country. And here's where the dangers come if, in fact, the war of terrorism is set in an era of cantankerous relations between the United States and its economic and military partners around the world. Any country in the world can use the story of saying, we're going to build, for example, the security of our food supply by having special rules about food security, to justify protecting their agricultural market against imports. Underneath the rules of the World Trade Organization, for example, your general trade obligations can always be superseded by legitimate security measures. So now take the world of information technology, communications technology, food, infrastructure such as aircraft and water, and imagine a world in which bad relationships between Washington and the rest of the world lead to a situation in which allies say, sure, we're going to do security, but we're going to do security of our infrastructure in a way that essentially shuts out U.S. suppliers and encourages the selection of local suppliers. This is the sort of long-term linkage between economic relationships in the world and security policy that stands as a potential threat to the integration of the global infrastructure and to the interests of the full range of companies represented in San Diego, ranging from biotechnology in the drug industry through agricultural exporters to the communications and information technology industry. And it's finding ways of reconciling our rules for trade and investment globally with the rise of security measures that are going to be needed. That's going to be one of the critical challenges for managing the world economy in the future. Thank you.